especially also to Colleen Shantz, who reached out to me about this and invited me. I'll dive in. I do believe I should have, yep, all right, so I'm gonna be able to share the screen. It's not quite as much fun to give talks on Zoom or to be in conferences on Zoom, as we all know, because you get this when you can only see sort of the just this little few group of people on the right, and I love to make eye contact with people during talks, the whole crowd. So just pretend that I'm doing that. So I'm going to talk about ritual play and the landscape of value, as Nathan mentioned. What I'm hoping to do with this talk is to bring the biological and cognitive sciences into contact with the humanities. I don't know where most of you are located, but I would imagine it's probably more on the humanities side than on the sciences side. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but regardless, I think it's important to sort of bring them together around this question of how it is that we create value or choose to value certain things over other things, or understand the importance of things. I'm going to start with play. The historian Johan Huizinga wrote a really wonderful, tiny little book about 100 years ago. I think not quite 100 years ago, but a long time ago, entitled Homo ludens, the study of the play element in culture. I had to look up the subtitle there. Homo ludens meaning man the player. He argues that play is actually the root of culture, in the sense of giving rise to all the great archetypal activities of human society, which are all permeated. I'm going to move my screen here a little bit. All permeated with play from the start. So anything from coronations to rituals, in religious rites, to greetings, to card games, and even things that seem pragmatic, like traffic directions and laws and all kinds of contests and patterns of behavior are all rooted in what he calls play, which is not ordinary life. Play is that which is outside of the immediate satisfaction of wants and appetites. And there we go. And it, in fact, interrupts the appetitive process. What he means there is the play is not, it's not immediately pegged to the satisfaction of basic biological or physiological needs. If we're playing, we're not trying to get food right then. We're not trying to accomplish something that's going to enable our survival right then. And that play takes place within artificial boundaries that set off that realm of not being focused on the pragmatic directly from the place where we are outside of those boundaries. So the artificial boundaries mark out the space and the time of play from everyday order. It's important that it's not just space. It's not just like it's not just a magic circle or something like that. It's actually that when playing, we mark the beginning of the play period and we mark the end of the play period. You could think of an example from like the Olympics with the large ceremony that sort of brings the Olympics together and inaugurates the proceedings. It's sort of a mark that we are moving into a period of game and sports and pursuits that are not going to get any of the players food or fish or anything like that from actually doing the activity. Of course, they might get paid later on when they go back home. So that ordering and boundary making creates order and is order, according to Huizinga. What's important, of course, is that the boundaries that mark off the play space from the regular space are artificial. They are not natural kinds. They are not natural entities. Instead of being made of bricks and mortar, they're made of rules and agreements. So here we have a soccer pitch, excuse me, and the offsides line and the midfield line and those things are not, there's nothing physically there stopping players from crossing them, right? It's just paint on a field. And so the way that we coordinate and constrain our own behavior in relation to the lines on a field has everything to do with our rules and nothing to do with any sort of physical barrier or limitation. And so again, he says that this sort of rulemaking and boundary creation is actually the root seed for civilization itself. And when he says civilization, he doesn't mean, Paris in 1890, sort of the heights of, European whatever. He's talking about every kind of culture. Civilization is human culture in his definition, and every single society since in the history of the human species does this. We create boundaries, we create structure out of activities that Huizinga says are essentially play-like. So what does he mean when he talks about play precisely? What are the characteristics of play? Huizinga argues that play is voluntary. It's not forced. That means that it's, if you're about to fall from a ladder and you reach out and you grab, the wall or something, that's not voluntary. You're doing that because you're physically forced into doing that so that you don't fall and hurt yourself. Play is patterned. It's characterized by repetitions. It's structured in a way that is replicates itself over time. Play is set apart, as I just mentioned, either spatially or conceptually, or I should have also said temporally there, from other activities. And it doesn't aim at practical ends or survival. So one thing about this last point is that you could easily make the case, well, yeah, I mean, like a football player does the game, a professional football player, a professional baseball player, soccer player, they are surviving through their play, right? That's their salaries coming from that. And so there's some gray areas there. But what Huizinga says is that the opposite of play is not unseriousness, or is not seriousness. He says that play is, we shouldn't interpret this criteria on it, that it doesn't aim at practical ends or survival, to mean that play is somehow directly counterposed to serious endeavors. He says that play can be perfectly serious. We can take it, and often do, we take on play in absolute earnest as if something really matters. And in fact, tension is one of the characteristics that he also ascribes to play. I didn't list that here. But if you think about a betting parlor or something like that, people are playing, but they're very serious about the game, and there's a tension that comes to a resolution at the end of the game. Many of these characteristics, Huizinga suggests, are shared with other animals. Play is kind of a fulcrum on which animal behavior and human culture meet. So he writes that animals play just like men. We have only to watch young dogs to see that all the essential features of human play are present in their merry gambols. They, dogs, invite one another to play by a certain ceremoniousness of attitude and gesture. That's the marking off of the playtime from regular time. They keep to the rule that you shall not bite, or not bite hard, your brother's ear, which means that during play, you don't treat things as practical, utilitarian objectives or tools. You don't treat your teeth in exactly the way that teeth are sort of designed to be used. So there's a restraint of capacities in play. And that's really key, because if you go back to the soccer pitch, again, there's nothing keeping you physically from moving outside of the field, right? To get out of bounds. You physically, you can walk all over wherever you want, but it's the artificial restraining of our biological capacities that gives rise to the structure of the game. So we say, okay, I could walk outside the offsides, but I'm not going to, because that would mean that I count as being offsides, and then that goal won't count. And then there's in animal play, there's that restraint of capacities also. The dog won't, you could tell you're playing with an animal, because when it bites you, I've got a cat right here, I play with him all the time. When he bites me, it's like, it doesn't, he's not hurting. He's not using teeth for what teeth are evolutionarily designed for. He's using them for play. So I'll move from Huizinga now to the ethological study of play. It's a famous book by Gordon Burghardt on the genesis of animal play. Ethology is the study of animal behavior. It's also called behavioral biology. So Burghardt takes an ethological approach to play. It's slightly different from the more humanistic one of Huizinga, who is an historian. But as you see, there's a lot of overlap in their ideas about play. So Burghardt's criteria for play are that first, the performance of the behavior, this is for animals, is not fully functional in form or context. It doesn't contribute to immediate survival. So these cute little bear cubs back there are not, they're not getting any food or anything like that as they're playing. They're having fun. And that means that their behavior is spontaneous, voluntary, intentional, pleasurable, reinforcing, or autotelic. Autotelic meaning for its own sake. It's not done for something outside of the play. Play is for its own sake. The actions are incomplete, exaggerated, awkward, or involve modified behavior patterns. This will be important. We'll come back to this. They're performed repeatedly in a similar way, although they're not rigidly stereotyped. And play actions are initiated when an animal is adequately fed, healthy, free from stress. That is, it's in a relaxed field. So you don't see animals playing when they are starving, or when they're hungry, or when they need to accomplish some sort of very practical task. It's only when all the basic needs have been met that the field opens up, the field of emotions and motivations and things like that to allow for play. Which is part of why it's baby animals, it's young animals that do most of the playing, because they're not out there hunting or gathering their own food. At first, at least. So comparing Burghardt and Huizinga, you can see that this first criterion matches fairly well with one of Huizinga's. Play is not practical or focused on survival. It's voluntary. They both emphasize this voluntary and autotelic nature of play. It's patterned and characterized by repetitions. So if you ever watch kittens playing, they do a lot of the same things over and over and over. Although it's not rigid, it's patterned. And it's set apart spatially or conceptually. And that's sort of an overlap with the idea that it only happens in certain contexts when there's a relaxed field. That's not a exact analogy, but you can see that the humanistic conception of play that Huizinga develops and the behavioral biological one of Burghardt have a lot of overlap. Where they don't overlap is in Burghardt's third criterion, that behavior is incomplete, exaggerated, awkward, or involves modified behavioral patterns. That's because once you get into behavioral biology, you start paying more attention to motor behavior, which is something that is new when you move from the humanities into biology. So this will be relevant to our discussion of ritual in just a second. In talking about these boundaries that mark off play, one way of describing them is as frames. And in a cognitive psychological sense, we create frames by marking them off, and that really characterizes pretense play. So make-believe play. Famous psychologist Alan Leslie has great paper on the origins of pretense and development, and argues that reality-oriented play responds to an object's actual properties or expresses knowledge of its conventional use. But pretense poses a deeper puzzle. How is it possible for a child to think about a banana as if it were a telephone, or a suitcase as if it were an airplane? And there's that distinction between what things could be physically for and what they can be in play again. So a suitcase is for, in its conventional and its physical affordances, what it's actually physically structured for is carrying stuff. And it's got clasps and things like that that are not, those are not subjunctive, they're not imaginary. But in play, you can make it into something else. So there's again that disjoint between what is physically possible, or what things are physically for, and where they go or how they're used in play. So there's this kind of play zone marked off by the frame that's outside of utilitarian life. Huizinga argues that there's actually no distinction now between marking out a space for a sacred purpose and marking it out for the purposes of sheer play. The turf, the tennis court, the chessboard, and pavement hopscotch cannot be formally distinguished from the temple or the magic circle. So now we're moving into the study of ritual. I'm going to have some tea, keep myself going. This is not something that everybody agrees with Huizinga about, as we'll see. But there are formal similarities between this cognitive and behavioral marking off of play spaces and the creation of specific spaces for sacred activities, not just physical spaces, but temporal spaces also. So essentially, Huizinga is making a strong point that this, although it looks very different, is formally the same kind of thing as this. In a sense that, you know, inside of the room or inside of the box, different rules apply for behavior than they do outside in the regular world as the kids are playing here. And in a similar way, different rules apply within the walls of a consecrated church in the Catholic, Roman Catholic world than they do outside. And priests are being consecrated, which means they're shifting from one status to another status. So what is the relationship then between play and ritual? Like I said, not everybody agrees with Huizinga that they're formally the same kind of thing, although most people acknowledge that they have a lot of overlap. So where is that overlap? Well, let's look at the actual formal features of play and ritual, if we can. We've already looked at those of play with Huizinga and Burghardt. Now let's look at those of ritual and ritualization in animals and in human beings. So again, in behavioral biology and ethology, we're drawing from Julian Huxley here, the brother of Aldous and the grandson of T.H. Huxley. Julian coined the term ritualization from observing the mating behavior of crested grebes here, of which this is a picture. Crested grebes do some of the most spectacular mating dances in the animal world, including picking up bits of weeds from the bottom of the lake and throwing them around at each other. Probably not a great idea on a first date for humans, but it's like the peak of romance for grebes. And as Huxley studied these acts of ritualization, he identified some traits. They're genetically specified. That is, they're instinctive. So these birds don't learn developmentally how to do this mating ritual. It's innate. All grebes do this. And the ritual is formalized. It's stereotyped, it's repetitive, it's exaggerated, it's redundant. I shouldn't be calling it a ritual. I should be calling it ritualized behavior. So ritualized behavior, again, formalized, stereotyped, repetitive, exaggerated, redundant. You'll notice that emphasis on stereotypy and formalization marks off somewhat a distinction from what Burghardt described as play, because he specified that the play behavior is not super stereotyped or rigid. Huxley also noted that often ritualization repurposes standard behavioral sequences for other purposes. So foraging behavior or preening behavior are key examples. A lot of birds, they preen themselves, their feathers, for cleanliness and for sanitation, for health. But that's a practical purpose. But then in mating contexts and other contexts, that preening becomes repurposed for a signaling function. And that signaling function resolves ambiguity by exaggerating and repeating stereotyped activities to say, I'm not doing this for the sake of preening. I'm not trying to clean myself. I am trying to send a signal. And the signal is, I'm interested in you, or I'm not going to threaten you. Similarly, the foraging behavior for getting weeds from the bottom of the lake gets repurposed into a very formalized and repetitive sequence of actions that's designed to clarify a signal. So ritualization in animals is fine-tuned for communication, especially in ambivalent or ambiguous situations like play fighting and mating. Mating in all animal species is motivationally linked with aggression. And so it's a potentially dangerous situation, or potentially a situation that's ripe for misunderstandings. And so when animals do these ritualized mating sequences, what they're doing is they're saying, this is a situation that could be interpreted as either aggressive or amorous, because I'm going to make it very, 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 very clear through my repetitive behavior that this is not an aggressive situation. This is an amorous one. Similarly, in play fighting, here's a dog doing a play bow. This is a ritualized action that dogs do to mark off the beginning of play. Play fighting could easily, again, be ambiguous, and sometimes does become real fighting, as you've probably seen. And so the ritualization of the initiation of the play sequence is a way of making clear to both parties or all parties that this is not an aggressive sequence. This is a fun sequence for playing. You have to make that really clear. Otherwise, the bared teeth and the sort of aggressive motions could easily be misinterpreted. And then it's sort of that indicates the status of the signaler and receiver. I'm playing. Are you going to play with me? The ritualization then allows for, in some cases, the animals to send meta-represented signals. This means that because animals don't have language, non-human animals don't have symbolic language, they can't send very complicated signals about things that are not happening right then and there, or which are not exactly represented in the physical status of what's going on. But the only way that they can say, so for example, a human could say, I'm not thirsty, or there's a good store on the next block. Those things are not immediately visible, so it's very difficult to send those signals without language. But with ritualization, animals do have a slight ability to do that. They can say, look, I'm putting myself in a vulnerable position. When this dog rolls on the ground like that, it's showing the belly, which is the vulnerable part. And so when a dog does that, it's saying, I am not vulnerable. I don't feel vulnerable. I trust you not to hurt me, because I know we're not fighting, we're playing. So it's a way to make a negation. And that's a very important innovation in animal behavior. Gregory Bateson writes that in mammalian interaction, the only way to achieve a proposition which contains its own negation, I will not bite you, or I'm not afraid of him, is by an elaborate imagining or acting out of the proposition to be negated. It's for this reason that agonistic or aggressive behavior commonly evolves into a friendly greeting. So in animal behavior, where the ritualization is genetically prescribed, behavior that is aggressive often over evolutionary time gets sculpted into, away from being just an aggressive behavior, into a signaling function, which signals this could be an aggressive situation, but look, it's not. Look, my teeth are showing. That normally means I'm going to get you, but I'm not getting you. So that means we're cool. And that's that is the sort of background evolutionarily for our propensity for smiling. Okay, so a human ritual, now we're moving from ritualization to ritual, is not genetically specified. That's really important. We have flexibility. Bar mitzvah is not something that people come into the world knowing how to do. It's something that is culturally inscribed and learned. But they are formalized, repetitive, redundant, stereotyped, causally, and importantly now, their rituals are often described in the cognitive science of religion as being causally opaque and goal demoted, as well as having finely parsed actions and repurposing, again, like animal ritualization, repurposing of utilitarian action sequences. So meals, carrying things, placing things, wearing clothing, all these things would normally be practical activities, but in a ritual, they are done in a way that is not for the purpose of leading to the normal practical outcome. And that's what's meant by goal. That's part of what's meant by there being goal demoted. Catherine Bell writes that certain features, formality, fixity, and repetition are central to ritual and ritualization. So again, there's all of those overlap with animal behavior. And specifically that ritualization is a way of acting that's designed to distinguish and privilege what is being done in comparison to other, usually more quotidian activities. So if you see somebody just chomp into a sandwich, that's not a signal, that's just somebody fulfilling a basic biological drive. If you see somebody hold up a wafer and crack it and carefully place it on a silver platter, that's not actually about eating. That's a signal that says, pay attention to what's going on here. This is important. So to return to this question of how play overlaps with ritual, although Ellen Dissanayake is a great scholar of play and argues that although the play is too protean to be exactly equated with ritual behavior because it's too flexible. You can do lots of different things with play, but it often uses the same devices that characterize ritualized behavior: stereotypy, repetition, exaggeration, elaboration, and surprise, thereby creating a non-ordinary world. So to return to this idea of stepping out of the regular world and into a frame where either we're playing or we're creating a ritualized sacred environment, many of the same features mark out those shifts. And what's important is that they do so because those shifts are ambiguous. They're not forced by the physical facts. It's not clear from just looking at the bricks where you need to start behaving differently as you enter a church. And that's why that boundary is so strongly ritualized often. I'm going to check my time because okay, great. So this question of causal opacity, that's a very jargony term in cognitive and developmental psychology, but it essentially means that if you're looking at somebody performing a ritual, if you're not embedded in the same cultural environment that they are, it would probably not be clear how the sequence of actions that they're taking on could possibly lead in a cause and effect way to the outcome that they're trying to accomplish. And that, so that directly implicates that sort of, that distinction again between what's going on in the ritualized play space being about signaling and communication versus being about physical facts. We as humans seem to be evolved literally to pick up and learn the ritualized activities that we see in the environment around us as we go through our developmental periods as we're children. What's interesting is that humans over-imitate each other. So there's some famous experiments by Leons and colleagues, and many others now, showing that, I should have had a slide for this. It's actually really interesting. It's cool. But what they do is they have a little box with a bunch of mechanisms in it and a treat in the middle. And you can physically, actually all you need to do to get the treat is just like open it up and get the treat. It's not complicated. but they have two versions of the box. They have a opaque version and a transparent one. So the transparent one, you can see looking at it like, oh, I don't need to do all this weird stuff. I can just pull out the tray and get the treat. But when they demonstrate to children's, it's early, to children and chimpanzees in different conditions, how to open the box, they'll do a very complicated sequence of actions. They'll tap the box, they'll open one thing that has no practical function, and they'll do it in the exact same sequence each time. When chimps and people see the opaque version where they can't see what's going on in the box, they both imitate very carefully how to open the box because they assume that it must have some each step must have some practical effect. But when the box is transparent, apes look at it and they say, why am I going to do all this other stupid stuff? I don't need that. I just want the treat. And they just open the box and get the treat. But people do not do this. People, even though they can see that there's no reason to do this, do all the tapping and all the unnecessary sequences before they get the treat. This is called over-imitation, and it characterizes the developmental pathway, the means by which ritualized behaviors and rituals become enculturated into new members of a society, whether they're children or converts or whatever. So this separation between what's practical and what's ritualized is something that goes far deeper in human beings than in even our closest great relatives. Chimpanzees are very, very social. They're quite physically smart. They have culture, right? They have technologies that they can pass down, like sticks that they put into termite mounds and withdraw so that they can eat the termites. Some groups have those sticks, some don't. That means it's not a genetically determined behavior. So chimpanzees are not just fully instinctive animals. They learn things from each other, but they do not learn impractical things from each other. We're the only species that we know of that does. Of course, every time somebody says people are the only species that X, like 10 years later, there's a bunch of studies that come out that are like, no, that's not true. Aardvarks do it. I don't know. That would be cool if that was true. So that ability to really, really deeply distinguish between the practical and the ritualized is part of what enables us to have such rich cultures as we do, and also to mark off frames and to make distinctions between things so deeply. In an imaginative sense, when I say distinctions, I mean saying something like, this is the inside of the temple and that's the outside. Another distinction that's really important is social transitions, such as from boy to man, single to married, girl to woman, citizen to president, that kind of thing. These transitions are inherently ambiguous. I'm going to focus on boy to man here because we've got a bar mitzvah. There is no point during, as many of you remember, all of you remember, right? Growing up, there's no point at which you wake up in the morning and you're like, I'm an adult, woo, physically, like I have hair, I didn't have it before, whatever. It's a long, gradual, messy, and unpleasant process to go from being a child to an adult. And there is no objective physical point at which it's clear that that's completed. And so many, probably the majority of cultures have transition rites of passage, as Van Gennep called them, that clarify that distinction. They make it more salient through the tools we've been talking about, through the repetition, the formality, the fixity, the exaggeration. These things clarify that transition by saying, look at this is special. Just like Catherine Bell talked about. This moment is special. We're wearing clothes that are clearly not for practical purposes. We're eating a meal that is clearly not just to satisfy physiological needs. This is special, and it means that the transition that's being affected is not a physical one, but a social one. It's a transition of roles. So we create roles, which we all inhabit, many different roles, through ritualization. That's why it doesn't feel good for most people to have had to graduate this last year without a formal graduation ceremony, right? High schools all across North America kids graduated, but they didn't get to walk down that aisle and grab their diplomas with their friends wearing funny clothing. It leaves to us, the ritualization creates a clarity that leads to a sense of there being a reliable social agreement that we have changed roles. I see it, you see it, we agree on it. And that leads to the greater predictability regarding the different obligations and rights and so forth that different roles have. So another example is a knighthood, right? Knighthood is not an objective or empirical physical entity. It's just a social subjunctive. And it has its own rights and normative obligations. It used to have more of them. Now I'm not really sure what they are. I think it's just, you get to have like some letters after your name. But because it's not a physical fact, right, it has to be made very clear what's going on. And so the sword tapping and the clothing and the formality of the rite make that transition much clearer. Note that, again, if you're taking the perspective of a cognitive psychologist and you look at this thing happening, you realize there's no physical cause and effect relationship between tapping somebody on the shoulder with a sword and creating a knight. It's an opaque causality. And that's because it's not a physical causality, it's a social one, it's a signal. And again, looking at the sword has been repurposed from a military utility to one that is formalized for communication. So again, that repurposing of behaviors goes all the way back to animal ritualization and up into the most elaborate forms of human ritual. The repetition or redundancy that this kind of ritualization affects, right? There's not just a sword tapping, there's a verbal statement, there's kneeling, there's a number of things going on, and that redundancy is something that you could even see in engineering as being, well, I'll just read Edmund Leach's anthropologist quote, in ritual, ambiguity is reduced to the same message that's repeated over and over again by different channels and in different forms, which corresponds to the communication engineer's technique of overcoming noisy interference by the use of multiple redundancy. You make things clearer than they would have been otherwise. And so Robert Bellah argues that play in the form of ritual, that the aspects of ritual that are play-like allow humans to imagine and then act out or perform multiple realities. There are options. Not every society has a president, not every society has a king. We can choose, in principle, which transitions to effect and which sort of ritualized signals to send. And it's that ability to repurpose and to exaggerate behaviors and repeat them and formalize them that allows us to come up with such wildly varying ways of solving our social problems, like who should be in charge, how should our government be structured, et cetera. Now I'm going to conclude here with by taking us into the question of value from this question of options. So there are many options for how to do things in any human society. Our rituals are not genetically fixed. We're not crested grebes. We can do our mating rituals in many different ways. We can do our coronation rituals in many different ways. We can not have kings. We can have kings. We can all kinds of things. So the structure of options characterizes human life and behavior. And underneath that structure of options are what we might call brute facts, which is just the way that the world looks when we're not seeing it from within a particular cultural standpoint. Now, of course, that's actually impossible because our brains and our cognition are inherently cultural, but you can get a better or worse view of what things look like in an objective setting. Thomas Nagel called it the view from nowhere. And he also argued, Nagel, that you can't get to the view from nowhere completely, that scientific view of pure objectivity, but that you can get more or less close to it. And the point I'm arguing here is that the closer you get to that view from nowhere, where you see things just as they are physically, objectively, the less value you see in it, in the sense that there's the landscape of just brute facts is flat. It's a flat landscape. Any single data point means just as much as any other data point because it's like a list instead of a story. With ritualization, we create stories out of lists. So we create landscapes of value. This might seem a little romanticized. Obviously, we can create bad values through ritualization too, but I just thought this was a cool picture, and that's how it is. So the landscape of ritual is not flat. It's like a valley and mountains. It creates points of emphasis and points of de-emphasis, like a map as opposed to a territory. Peaks and valleys. When we ritualize messages that otherwise would be ambiguous, we do so using the same reinforcing and frame building features as play. This person was a citizen, now she is a prime minister. We focus on things and highlight them through that frame, those framing and disambiguating techniques of ritualization. We create boundaries, and those boundaries, that boundary forging function is a key step in the tectonic processes that punch out mountains in the otherwise flat landscape of raw facts. Ritual thereby transforms the flat landscape of raw data into a topography in which there are peaks and valleys of value, things that we highlight and emphasize and things that we do not. This is pure Catherine Bell. It does this by clarifying distinctions between things and then encoding some chunks of carved up data as valuable and obscuring other chunks of it as unimportant. A very good example of this would be in a Passover Seder. The things that are important are the performances of the sequence of the Passover, of the Seder, right? The dropping of the dots of wine for the plagues of Egypt, that's important. A little bit of wine that splashes out onto the table, not important. What's important is what's emphasized in the ritual sequence. Everything else is de-emphasized. I guess that's the end. And so this is how ritual and ritualization, which share a behavioral foundation in the flexibility that play affords to ritualize behavior. So again, that's an incomplete sentence. I'm not going to finish that sentence. Stop trying to track it. Animals have ritualized behaviors that are genetically inscribed. They're not flexible. They just have them. Those ritualized sequences clarify, they disambiguate, they separate practical functions from signaling functions. Play uses many of the same features and is the only point at which animals can be flexible about that behavior by creating frames, right? When a dog does a play bow, it's saying, okay, now we're going to play. And that ritualized behavior, which is itself genetically inscribed, that's not a learned behavior, the play bow of a dog. When a dog does that, it uses a genetically inscribed sequence in order to mark out a space where the behavior is more flexible, where it's not just pure instinct, where dogs can play in many different kinds of ways. We expand on that with the use of language being a key part of that expansion to create spaces in which behavior is exponentially more flexible. And because of that flexibility, the endless landscape of possibilities, we then use the the tools of ritualization to create certain possibilities out of others, to highlight those that are important in our world and to de-emphasize those that we're not going to pay attention to. There's plenty more to say about this, and maybe some of it will come up in our conversation afterwards. I'm very grateful to you for inviting me here, and I hope you enjoyed this talk. I want to thank the Graduate Students Association at the Toronto School of Theology and the University of Toronto. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks to Colleen Shantz again, and funding from the John Templeton Foundation. And finally, I would like to thank my wife, Lexi, who put up with me putting this presentation together. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think we could all join in thanking our speaker. That is what remains to us, either visually or somehow with that. Thank you very much, Connor, for that very engaging talk. I'm sure we have lots of richness to bring, not only for this conversation right now, but throughout the day. And I really appreciate you initiating us into that. So we're going to move to a bit of time for conversation here. We have about 25 minutes for that. So like I said before, if you would like to ask a question, you can post that into the chat, or you can use the raise hand function under, if you click on participants on your screen there, you should be able to raise your hand. So I see a first question here from, let's go with Maureen first. If you could maybe say your name and say where you are, or your affiliation or something. With that. Maureen, am I wrong? Is that not a hand up? Oh, it's a clap. I see. I'm sorry. I'm learning this too. Let's begin with Patrick. I think I saw yours there first. Patrick Nole.
Hi, Connor. Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Patrick. I'm at Regis College at the Toronto School of Theology. Fascinating presentation. Unfortunately, I missed the first maybe 5 minutes or so, but it was really interesting to see the transition and what you're talking about with play. The only question I have, and it's one that literally just came to mind, so it needs a little bit of unpacking. But your ending point here is to show that animals have genetic imprintation almost. Again, I'm paraphrasing the terms you're using for creating frames of play, and that humans are a lot more flexible in this regard due to our ability to be kind of reflective and introspective on which avenues we would like to pursue. However, would you tend to agree as well that due to cultural and also historical almost imprintation or impression upon the individual at moments of birth or or child development, that in some way it's not genetic determinism upon our forms of communication and frames and pretenses, but it's not as flexible as maybe other scholars would say about where we can express ourselves and how others may interpret our behaviors.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. That's a great set of questions. Yeah, I would agree. Actually, I think that, if I had 4 lectures, if I were giving us a series of lectures, one of them would be focused on the ways that human ritual serves to conceal options, not just to highlight them. So, obviously, Catherine Bell and others, have argued that one of the functions of ritual is legitimation. One of the key functions of ritual is legitimation, and that's why things like power transitions are so heavily ritualized, because it's often contested. Look through the history of the European Middle Ages and the lifespan of kings. They had a lifespan of something like 10 or 15 years less than the average person, because they were always getting whacked. There's a lot of tension and conflict inherent in the ascension to political power, which is why it's so robustly ritualized in so many contexts, because it does serve to legitimize that inhabitation of a new role. And in terms of the sort of granular features of ritual, what's interesting is that there are some features like fine-grained action parsing, which I did not talk about as much as I'd like to have in this conversation, but to a classic example of the consecration of the host in Christian Eucharist, Catholic or other sort of sacramental versions of Christianity, right? There's especially in a very high sort of church setting, there's a lot of very slow focus on, right? It's not like people, it's just all crack, it's like, it's a very slow sort of focus, which means that you're actually, you're focusing on each step sort of individually instead of the goal at the end. You're not racing through it. And that actually, many people argue, sort of floods our working memory, so that you're not thinking too much about the end goal. You're just focusing on each step sort of in an immersive way, and that can affect the way that messages are transmitted. On the other hand, rituals can be completely routinized, and that's one of the things that makes rituals is you just walk into church and you're not thinking about it. You're sort of just doing the action, or if you've it was going to the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, sorry, in Jerusalem, and the davening is different depending on whether you're seeing it as an outsider or deeply aware of the way it works. Because if you're doing it as a believer who's come, you just all the actions are not, you're not focusing super clearly on each small action. You're just going through the whole sequence. And so, to get to your question, I think that habituation feature of ritual does lead to a reduction of options in a way that's, again, like you said, it's not genetically fixed, but it becomes fairly fixed developmentally. What's interesting about that is that there are probably key developmental windows within which that can happen most easily, up to adolescence being one of them. So many of you probably know that language is a developmentally windowed period. If you don't learn a language by the time you're 4 or 5, you never will successfully. You might learn individual words, but you'll never get grammar. So the brain is primed. It's called experience expectancy. The brain is primed to learn this particular kind of skill in this particular window, which is why many people think that language is an instinctive skill. It's not something we just learn culturally. It's something that we're built for. Similarly, I would argue that this is probably true for ritualization and ritualized behaviors as well, that we are sort of, we come primed to incorporate certain rituals into our habituated behaviors within a certain window. The last thing I want to say about that is that I think animals' ritualized behaviors also include more flexibility than I gave them credit for. The cat I just mentioned, who I was worried was going to be talking the whole time, has passed out. That's great. But we have a particular ritual when I come home. He runs up to me, he flops on the carpet, I thump him, we wrestle a little bit. That's not, don't do that with other cats. Do not try that with other cats. That will get you maimed. We have a specific thing that is not genetically fixed in him. He just decided he wanted to do it this way. So
thanks for that. Can we go to Arinze for your question? I'm sorry, I think you're muted there.
Hello.
There we go. Yep.
Yes, thank you for your wonderful presentation, Connor. I have 2 things to contribute. One is like a validation, and then the other is more of a wanting to seek more clarification from you. The one on the side of validation is that as you kept giving your talk, I noticed, to me, in the field where I do my research, that what you were saying about ritual and play, especially with ritual, comes close to sounding like what might be considered commonplace metaphors. And because generally metaphors are seen as, like the way Aristotle would define it, as seeing similar in the dissimilar. So when you talk about the formalized pattern in rituals that can be repurposed for other things, that seemed to come across to me as how metaphors work. Though how you were saying it sounds, it seems in a different setting, that's like within rituals or in practical social situation, it applies differently. So that is on the side of seeing that there is some kind of validation from what you said, the talk you gave, to what part of what my research is on. And on the side of clarification, I didn't quite get where you were talking about the opaque nature of rituals. Like the example you gave with knighting, the knighthood with a sword, placing the sword on the shoulder. And if I get you well, you were trying to say that when you look at that act of placing the sword to knight someone as part of the ritual of moving someone from someone who is not a knight to someone who becomes a knight. That's ritual. Looking at it, I was wondering if there is nothing about the history of knighthood that makes that sword placing somehow something that remains like a remnant of how knighthood. So there is still some element of objective reality that may no longer be functional currently, but still continues to be attached to what's being a knight or how the process of knighthood comes about. So that is one. And one other example I want to give with regards to that is with our computer world. You know, some of the icons we use, like the icon for save, for instance, is still the floppy disk icon, but we know that today nobody uses a floppy disk. So all I want to say is that in semiotics, there is something called three distinctions of types of signs. There is something called the index, the icon, and the symbol. So it seems to me that the placing of the sword would now be more on the symbolic type of sign, but which must have come from the iconic, you know, during the time of crusades and things like that. So there is still, if you check the history, it will be a lot of something that remained after something that began. So I just needed to get clarification on what you meant by the OPEC as opposed to an objective type of ritual.
Those are great questions. Thanks so much. There's a lot to dig in there. I'll go in order. So your first point was about the sort of formal similarities between ritualization and metaphor. Did I right? And I think that's in a lot of ways that's spot on, because a metaphor is when a concept is not the concept that it actually is. It's you know, and similarly, a ritualized object or relationship is not the thing that it actually is. Just like play uses animal play, dogs, let's just focus on dogs, right? Uses many of the same actions and motor sequences and expressions as fighting, but it's not fighting. And that's what Bateson was talking about, is that's essentially the only way that animals have to do anything like have metaphors. They can negate something by saying, this thing that looks like this, it's not actually this. And similarly, in human language, we have the ability to say something that is clearly not what it normally would mean. That something that's interesting about that is that as language becomes more metaphorical and less literal, it tends to become much more ritualized. So an example is an engineering schematic or a legal document versus poetry. Poetry is where you find metaphors. You use metaphors, you use similes, things do not mean exactly what they mean. And what's interesting about poetry is how ritualized it is compared with normal language. What I mean is it focuses on the prosody more than on the explicit content. It focuses on patterns of cadence. It detaches language from its practical function. And so there's, whereas an engineering readout is just, it just doesn't care about prosody at all. It doesn't care about the meter. It doesn't scan. It's not trying to scan. It's just trying to convey raw information. And that's sort of what I was mentioning at the end, that raw information is flat because it's the metaphor and the ritualization that creates structure of value, saying this is important, this is important, this is not important, this is important. So I hope that kind of addresses what you were talking about at that point. In terms of the Peircean semiotics, right? So you were talking about Charles S. Peirce, the American pragmatist philosopher who kicked around with William James a lot, and developed this tripartite semiotics in which he distinguishes between symbols, indices, and icons. I should have put those in different order. Symbols, icon, index, where a symbol is something that represents another thing in a purely conventional sense. There's absolutely no formal or causal relationship to it. So the word dog refers to dog in a conventional sense, which is why it's gay in Korean and Chen in French and Hund in German and whatever. And then in an icon, the symbol, the sign visually or some other way represents the thing that it's supposed to, resembles the thing that it's supposed to represent. So your points about the little icon of the floppy disk, sort of like iconically representing saving something. It's interesting, obviously, because younger people probably have no idea what the heck that actually is. But it still sort of iconically reflects something that used to be used for saving. And then an index is something that is causally related to the thing it represents. So bear scat in the woods is an index that there was a bear there. It's not a symbol. It doesn't look like a bear. It means there was a bear here for a fact. So that's an index. A thermometer is an index of temperature, right? A physical thermometer with mercury in it. In terms of the knighting and that kind of thing, I would still argue that to knight someone, you're right that there's an iconic function there. The sword sort of iconizes the martial function that knighthood once had. What I meant by saying that it's not a causal, it's not an index in a physical way, is that a knighthood is not something that can be caused physically, because it's a status, it's an institutional fact, it's not a brute fact. So you can cause the pins in a bowling alley to knock down by hitting them physically with the ball, but you cannot physically cause that to give you 10 points, because 10 points is a social construct. And so what I'm arguing is that things that are social constructs require heavy ritualization to reinforce. And I should just point out that when I say social construct, I don't mean like it's illegitimate or like it's just, I just mean literally it's something that we come up with as an agreement that's based on norms and rights and so forth, rather than on physical causality.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left in our scheduled time for questions here, and about 5 people who still are asking things. So I move if you would like to within we can go over a little bit in the break, but feel free when we get to 11:25 to go off, if that's okay with our presenter. But I go to Michael Rogers now, who had his hand up here for his question.
Connor, thanks so much for your paper. I guess I have a question about the evolutionary status of ritual. So somebody like Victor Turner would say that the point of ritual is to bind us all together sort of more tightly as a community, right? That we go through this liminal process. I mean, not entirely, but that's a part of the point. And somebody like Harvey Whitehouse would say, Whitehouse would say, look, ritual and religion evolve out of a need for closer communities which protect us sort of against threats, right? That these ritual realities bind us against threats, and that's why it becomes evolutionarily advantageous to be religious, at least in the beginning. I guess I'm wondering if, as you think about play, particularly when you're applying it to sort of animals, if play is sort of where ritual comes up the evolutionary scale, and that's how it evolves the thing that we end up using in the context of religion.
Could you just ask that last part of the question again?
Sure. I guess so. If somebody like Whitehouse is saying this is an evolutionary response, right? That religion is ultimately an evolutionary response. He's not saying that it's not a real thing, right? He's just saying it's hardwired into us because the ritual involved binds us more closely together as a community, and that being bound as a community protects us against threats, existential or otherwise. I guess I'm wondering if you see play as the place where you can observe sort of the evolution coming up to the scale from non-human to human, and if that's a place that maybe we can sort of further affirm Whitehouse's supposition.
Sure. Yeah, I think that that's basically true in terms of, I think play is sort of the root of the flexibility that we have for ritual, that we can have so many different kinds of rituals and different kinds of structures. I would not say that, I would not affirm everything that Harvey Whitehouse has to say. I don't think that ritual is just about bonding. I actually think that's like a boogeyman of mine. I think that ritual does create bonding, but it also creates distinctions and hierarchies and structures. And that's why Turner argues that we must have the rituals of communitas, because there's essentially, again, there's this disjoint between what's physically true and what's normatively or conventionally or symbolically true. And as we live in that symbolical world where we have roles and everything, we bash up against each other, people get resentful of the hierarchies, et cetera. And so you end up with this need to reconstitute the society at a more direct, in a more direct way, to bind each other together. And what's interesting about that is that you often do things like dancing, or you might even have mood altering substances and so forth that actually take us out of the subjunctive space where things are not what they are and put us into the space where things actually are what they are. We are really dancing. We are really on drugs, whatever. It's, you know, that's where I think there's something interesting going on there. So it's a move out of the play world. The bonding features of ritual are actually a move out of the play world.
Thanks, that's a really helpful distinction.
All right, we got a few minutes here. Let's go to Mookie Manalili for your question, please.
Hey, Connor and everybody. Super fascinating and interesting. Just a little bit about me. That way you can kind of see like where my neurotic question is coming from. I'm a practicing psychotherapist and I do a little bit of research in social neuroscience, but I also have a background in theology where I studied with some of the fine people over here. I guess my question is on the idea of a play and its relationship to creativity and even the aesthetics, kind of like what is beyond the rigid logic, even of like language structures and things like that. You alluded to it as you talked about like poetry, right? And how metaphors bring about something that is beyond the structure per se. So that's kind of where the question's going to be heading. A little bit too, I really appreciate you weaving in a little bit of like developmental psych and things like that in terms of like how we constitute the world. Also, right, like recent studies are coming out in terms of, right, like brain maturation and things like that. And I know that's only tangentially related to developmental psych, but it's interesting to know for you and for people interested is, yeah, the brain actually goes to 2 stages of synaptic pruning. People are realizing one in early childhood and one in adolescent phase. So we can begin to continue to learn language. There's a decline in about like 18 years old. But yeah, Connor's really correct in saying that it's very much easier in early childhood, although not impossible. And then, you know, for biological males, brain maturates mid-20s, for biological females earlier, and then for some males, it just never happens, and it's great. Jokes aside, like all that to say that even if you kind of have like brute highways, you can go out of your way to learn something. It just will take you extra scaffolding per se, and there'll always be a lag time. All that to say that, like, yeah, I'm curious because ritual kind of, we begin to think of it as, oh, it only reinstates a certain symbolic function, you know, whether it's bonding or whatnot, or, you know, keeping a rigid hierarchy and structure. But I'm curious, especially as you talk about its relation to, right, like Homo ludens, humans as playful creatures, and even C.S. Peirce, the semiotician, kind of says that, you know, after logic and ethics, there's actually aesthetics, beauty, a place where we begin to blur the lines. So especially with the idea of, as still a Catholic, even with all of the things that we have to work through in our church, how do you see like the newness of the spirit being brought about, right, by something quote unquote as rigid as ritual? You know, is it the symbolic function in which, right, C.S. Peirce loops in his final kind of like pragmatic maxims, he actually switches out activity for the idea of symbol, and the fullness of the symbol is what happens when the effects are brought about by the symbol itself, and that is the wholeness of the symbol.
Sure.
And right, so is creativity the kind of final end goal of, yeah, I don't know, the rituals in which Christ institutes for things like Eucharist and things like that? So love to hear more of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, we're at 11:25, so if anybody wants to pop off and take a break, please do feel free. For this, yeah, I don't think I think that creativity is, as a deeply important part of ritual, as I think I've alluded to, that there's this ability to create new options or to live out new directions because of ritual. However, I think ritual is also, it's also a rigidifying function. It's one of the frustrating things about trying to study religion through scientific methods is that you need, in order for science to work, you need monovalent, and non-polysemic definitions. And when you get into ritual, it's just like, it's not really possible. It's all over the place. It's this and that. It's rigid and it's creative. It's, and so I would point out though that I just mentioned this sort of distinction between rituals of bonding and rituals of structure. That's a term of art that I just made up. There's probably better ones out there, but rituals of communitas and rituals of structure, social structure, as Turner would call it, are there. I think both entail creativity, but I think that in terms of change, it tends to be the rituals of bonding that enable change and flexibility. So that's why I don't know if anybody has read much of the work of Erica Bourguignon, the anthropologist who's she's biologically oriented, quantitatively oriented anthropologist who studied altered states of consciousness and shamanism. And she has some really good work on the way that its altered states of consciousness are often the vectors by which social change is affected during times of stress or transition. So if things are all good, the rituals keep going, everything's fine. A drought hits, an invader comes, something big happens, inequality spikes to the point where the society stops being viable. It doesn't feel like we're all one. And that's when you start getting more rituals of bonding, more rituals focused on music and less on fine action parsing, and more altered states of consciousness where you get possession rituals and ecstatic trance rituals and so forth. So a good example of that was obviously is Pentecostal Christianity, which is spreading all over for example, in South America, which has traditionally been staunchly Catholic, and lots of people are converting to charismatic forms of Protestantism, in part because they're tired of the way things are, and Pentecostalism is very de-ritualized. It has rituals, but it's very focused on expression rather than inhibition of behavior. And that enables people to basically create new social imaginaries. I'm glad I get to use that word because you don't ever get to use that word in the cognitive sciences. But that's, that you get that flexibility from that kind of ecstatic dance and music focused type of worship. I think, the problem being, that it's not actually I would say it leads to creativity, but the actual forms of worship or ritual expression that you see in ecstatic, or what Harvey Whitehouse would call imagistic maybe types of ritual, are not actually creative in the sense that they are not they're not world building. There's something about a sort of Catholic Eucharist that builds a world. It says this thing is important. These things are important. these are not, right? It's just like I was talking about, it creates a structured landscape of value. Charismatic worship does not. And so it leads to it leads to a new flexibility in social forms and in the social imaginary, but it does not itself necessarily create an enduring new imaginary. It just creates the space for it. Does that, yeah.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. And with that, I think we're going to have to go to our break here, but whoever's still on the call, if you could still join me again in thanking Connor Wood for his time here, and beginning us off on these conversations. As you can see, there's still stuff going on in the chat for further questions that might be going. And Connor's email is now on our program. So if there's further questions or further conversations today, we'll go with that. So we'll be moving to our next paper session in just about 5 minutes. We'll take a little bit longer than that. So feel free to take your break. And thank you once again to Connor.
Thanks, everyone. I realized that I missed questions in the chat.
I was still going to be bringing those up if possible, but no worries with that. They're kind of public forum engagement kind of things. So
yeah.
No worries at all. So
thanks, everyone.
Okay, see you all in a few minutes.